little tyke.
I bet you did.
Anyway.
Most of Eugene when they were little tykes.
It's true. Okay, today I'm going to do something a little unorthodox, and only because I usually like to do kind of like my own research so that I can present a more comprehensive picture. But in '06, I was invited to a conference at Haskell, which is a Native American college. So you may be aware that there are, the first ones out of the boat were the historically black colleges and universities, and the original intention of Indian schools was basically to kill the Indian and save the man, so essentially as a tool of colonization. And so, yeah, when you have a boarding school, which is basically primary and elementary schools, well then you've got to sustain the work, so you create a college for Native Americans, right? And so that often continues the model of colonialism. So part of what happens with colonialism and imperial notions, so the empire, shall we say, validates certain knowledge. Paulo Freire talks about this as the banking concept. All right. Bring my banking concept. And part of that banking concept is that you have legitimate knowledge, which, like a bank account, it gets deposited in the minds of the student and delivered by the bankers, the faculty. And part of the thing with this, empirical knowledge, empirical, it's not only stuff that's written down, it's stuff that can be quantified in numbers. And this is coming from the Euro-American axiology of the epistemology, that is, the way we know the world is by counting and measuring. It isn't real unless you can count it and measure it. So, for example, one of the ways that this is socialized is with children's building blocks, which have numbers and letters, right? So that you can count your objects and also name them and write them down in an accounting mode, right? So part of the colonizer's knowledge is to basically erase any other forms of knowledge that existed before, so that the only legitimated knowledge is the ones that we teach in school. And so what Freire is talking about is, okay, well, what doesn't get captured then is, one, the indigenous knowledge that existed, that is extensive, may or may not have been written down, not because writing something down, the advantage of writing something down is that it preserves it beyond the physical life of the person, assuming further generations can read. That's one. Two, written knowledge is subject to interpretation, because the original intent of the writer might not essentially be being followed. And we can definitely see that with Christianity, right? So I'm doing a lecture tomorrow in a particular class where we're talking about the Harlem Renaissance, which we'll actually get to next term, because our time period here stops in 1877, so next class will be starting in 1877 and going till now. So instead of 17,000 years span, we'll basically do a little over a century. a little bit more in depth because you can basically see how our modern world is like built up somewhat. But part of the colonizer's knowledge and the colonizer's process is to basically erase indigenous knowledge, which might be things that you would be hard to write down, like relationships, like, you know, oh, this is why we do this, that, and the other, because we recognize that there are sentient beings that are not human. So, for example, and I don't mean this specifically as a criticism, but for example, we're rebuilding the center building, and it's going to be LEED certified, and it'll be sustainable. But you look at the concrete block, and there ain't no plants, no trees, no sustainable green roof. You know, okay, great. It's so the colonizer has basically taken that language of sustainability, which started out, for example, with Iroquois Six Nations. Oh, we don't clear cut our forests because they're not our forests. They're our great-great-great-grandchildren's forests. So we're only going to cut down enough to build a longhouse or other structures or ships or whatever. I mean, so when you look at sustainability in the larger societies where, you know, they've been around for longer than 1,000 years, nobody cuts down trees for paper. They cut down trees to make buildings or ships. Our word paper, papyrus, a sustainable renewable reed. Chinese, rice paper. Yeah, we're only going to use the seeds for food, but the rest of the plant we're going to use to make paper to write on, right? And use wood to build houses. You know, that would be more sustainable because, you know, we're not clear cutting forests to do that. So therefore we can sustain our civilization longer. So the concept of sustainability has kind of been appropriating it from indigenous cultures that had a way of knowing that wasn't necessarily written down, though part of the colonization process with native peoples is that, oh, well, in order for you to be civilized, you need to develop a syllabary, a alphabet. You need to worship from the King James Bible. You need to wear Western clothes. You need to live in square houses. You need to, you know, do agriculture, and that is planting, you know, crops. So the piece that I apologized for was at this conference, which is basically at Haskell, right next to Kansas University, so in Lawrence, Kansas. It's a Black Indian conference, and it's the first one that I'd ever been to, and it's out of American Studies, where we have, I mean, the largest group of Black Indians that I'd ever been to in my life that were like academically oriented, studying Black Indians as a subject matter. And, you know, we could argue about the terms. Well, the term Black Indians is problematic because it means that we're adopting the racial categories of the colonizer. Yeah, right. Yeah, what does that mean? Does that mean that, okay, so when we combine our two cultures with a native value towards long hair, well, how do Black Indians do long hair? Dreadlocks. Oh, right. Okay, but dreadlocks is older than coming to America, but okay, that makes sense, sure. Yeah, but we might not do the, you know, when somebody dies, we might not do the cutting our locks thing. Like, no, the person, the ancestor is woven into our locks. We don't cut the lock. I mean, you know, I mean, that's an individual choice. So one of the people whom I met there, who's a scholar, a Black Indian woman, Taya Miles, Dr. Taya Miles, who's married to a red Native man, so making that colonized distinction. There's Black Indians, there's red Indians. I'm not going to trip about whether you blonde hair, blue-eyed Indian, but whatever. You know, there is that distinction to be made because it kind of works out in terms of a policy way. I mean, our language is clumsy for talking about this stuff. It's hard stuff, it's difficult stuff. And so she did a lecture at the U of O in November about and entitled The Longest Unwritten Chapter. So I found that on my desktop from taking notes, and you know, now that we're in that period, I should talk about some of those issues, because we're leading off with, go to slide please, thank you. We're leading off with this idea of black Indians, black patriots, black cowboys, and also Oregon, because Oregon history, what Taya did in her lecture was basically, I used to think it was really crazy that the reason that black people were going to, you create a state, that is Oregon, that bans black American citizens from other states in the United States from coming, why? Specifically, well, because this guy Thurston said, oh, well, black people mix with Indians, and whenever they mix with the Indians, it's trouble for white folks. So that's why we're going to just ban black people. Really? That seems a little bit paranoid. But then Taya kind of filled in the blanks. Well, there was this war that happened, and the war ended in 1835, and when he made that statement in 1850, oh, well, that's just 15 years, so it's going to be fresh in his mind. But, yeah, okay. So I'm not going to make excuses for Thurston. But, so when she's talking about, ancestors, ancestor relations, and also ancestors' adversaries, they're often a mystery to be unraveled and uncovered. Because, again, the colonizer doesn't talk about this. And so you should definitely be aware of anything the colonizer don't want you to know. Because it's probably got some powerful stuff in it. Right? So history making, so a lot of this ethnic study stuff has been done, especially on the black side, especially a lot of the stuff that I've been telling you that you've seen, Afro-Europeans, black Indians, wait, well, that's part of history. How come they don't talk about that? Yeah, they don't even talk about that in popular culture. Hardly at all. So history making is a creative art in which many can apply and many can play at. So you basically have to, it's not simply just a story. His story, her, as Muda Baruka would say, his story, her story, their story, our story, right? It's, the implications of what those stories mean. So ethnic studies is about going into those places that are not safe, that have not been made civilized, that have not been made, common knowledge. And that can be, frankly, scary for some folks. And rightfully so. The scary part. But just because something is scary, what that means, or should mean, is that you learn to approach them with caution and courage. So Carter Woodson, the inventor of Negro History Week, which got expanded to Black History Month, right? We've talked about that, yes, where that came from? No? Okay. Here's how it works. Carter Woodson, so in the university there's history as a discipline, right? And when I refer to an amateur historian, I'm referring to someone that may or may not have university training and just have a personal interest. So Carter, I believe, did have a history degree or did go to college, but he basically started talking about subjects that were not covered by the Columbus discovered America narrative, and he's used as the model for what a black historian is. So he basically juxtaposed two figures that are influential in black history, one of whom is not black, or maybe he was black. We're not sure. So the idea is the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. Now, during Lincoln's presidential campaign and the debates with Stephen Douglas, Douglas accused Lincoln of having a black mama, right? I.e., he's a mulatto. Now, politics is a dirty game. If Lincoln was a brother, he's still got some explaining to do about some of his policies, which frankly are crazy. I'm sorry, maybe I shouldn't use that word, but they're not practical. All right, so we haven't got to this time period, but I'll just give you advance warning. So Negro History Week was basically the period in time, usually I think it's the second week of February, that bookended Douglas's birthday and Lincoln's birthday. And during that time, it's going to be like an internal black intelligentsia celebration of our history. We'll talk about it, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so that was an internal celebration within the black community. At least the literate, college-educated or self-educated black community. And it was celebrated internally for years until like the Watts riots. In which case, the Watts riots, the assassination of Malcolm X and then Martin Luther King 3 years later, we go, okay, say it, James Brown writes, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. And okay, Black Negro History Week, we ain't gonna be Negroes no more. We're gonna grow our hair long into afros, and we're gonna call ourselves Afro-American, then African-American, and we're gonna, we're not calling ourselves Negro, because when we were calling ourselves Negro in a fit of racial self-hatred, if you got called black, that was an insult. And to be dark-skinned was considered to be less than beautiful, because we were adopting the colonizers' view of racial skin lightening and blonde hair and straightening your hair and all that other kind of stuff. And Malcolm described that in his autobiography about, he was Detroit Red because he was going through this complex process of straightening his hair using lye, the caustic acid lye. So, which dyed his hair red. And so, not good, right? Why? Why are we going through this painful process of, straightening our hair? Why can't we be proud of not only our color, but our defined or kinky or whatever you want to call it, hair, right? So a lot of us weren't into the dreadlock thing at the time, but there were populations that were. So all this to say, Black History Month started right after Watts in the mid-60s, and okay, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. We're going to study this for February. So it's not a conspiracy to say Black History Month is the shortest month of the year. That's an entirely separate process. It's because we're just expanding Brother Woodson's Negro History Week to Black History Month. But we ain't just going to do it in February. We're going to do it all the time. Yeah, Eddie.
But he chose that week because those birthday dates bookended.
Yes.
He did that on purpose.
Yes, he did that on purpose. All right. So, for example, Frederick Douglass, Lincoln was the first president in the United States to gather a gathering of free blacks in the White House. He's the first one to do that before the Civil War. But basically, if you remember the other day when I was talking about the generation of crisis, the run-up to the Civil War, the crisis is, what do we do with all these black people? Slavery is no longer becoming tenable for not only moral reasons, but for economic reasons. We need to get rid of this. And that means, maybe we need to get rid of black people because, ship them back to Africa or whatever. And black people are participating in this conversation. Yeah, we're going back to Africa, all right? Forget America. I mean, there are a number of people that feel that way. So Lincoln brings in a group of black leaders, free black leaders, including Frederick Douglass, and he proposes the following. Slavery is going to tear the country apart. To avoid a war, let's ship all the black people to Costa Rica. And, and he just proposes that and goes on talking. And the black leaders are just like, really? Seriously? No. What do you think about this? No, we don't want to do that. For a variety of reasons. By the way, we've built the White House. We built Congress. We helped build this country. So, Lincoln was a moderate. So, when we get to the Civil War in a week or so, I'll go into this more in depth. But to propose the idea of sending 4 billion black people to Costa Rica, which is not part of the United States, I mean, great, the surfing's good, the climate's like Africa, but wait, it ain't even the United States. Why are you even proposing that? And logistically, how do you even do that? Right? So, that's the contrast. Douglass says, no. The solution, because Douglass was a Republican. This is when Republicans were cool, right? Republicans, the party of Lincoln, right? Lincoln freed the slaves, No, Lincoln was a moderate. The radical Republicans, of which Douglass is one, okay, the solution to slavery is to free the slaves. Make them American citizens. Oh, free the slaves. Make them American citizens. Give them free education. Give them the vote. Give them reparations for their free labor, 40 acres and a mule or whatever. If they want to go to college, they should go to college, but make them citizens in every way sense of the word. So that's 4 points. 5 points, eliminate white racial supremacy on any basis. And this is white Republicans that are saying this, in addition to Douglass. So that's the radical Republicans, and that's the first use of radical in the American nomenclature. The radical part was end slavery, make the slaves American citizens, end racial hierarchies of any kind now.
Do the right thing.
Do the right thing, right? That's radical? Wow, it's a thin line between radical and common sense, to quote my daughter on the subject, right? So, back to the slide. So Carter Woodson studied the relations of Negroes and Indians in Massachusetts. Now, why Massachusetts? Well, okay, good place to start, the Boston Massacre. How is Crispus Attucks and all these other black Indians who are basically contributing to society, how are they existing? Now, that study, the study's focus basically was not really attending to Africans in indigenous space. Okay? So he's talking about people like Crispus Attucks, Paul Cuffe, who are living with the whites who are of mixed Native and African heritage. But he's not discussing how are black people living with the Pequots, Six Nations, the Seminoles. Yeah, it's basically about black people living in white spaces, black Indians living in white spaces, not how black Africans live in indigenous space. Yeah.
So only validating the assimilated blacks into white society?
Yeah, I mean, that's how we would look at it from this point of view, right? The colonized point of view. That's why I kind of led off with, okay, there's indigenous knowing and there's colonizers knowing, and you have to understand how the colonizer focuses what you're seeing and correct for it, or see with your natural eyes. So, I mean, that's cool that that's what he wants to study, because obviously either he's writing about it or somebody has written about it, so it can be a subject of study. And that's one of the challenges with working in a university environment. You can only study that which has been written about, unless you're doing the pioneering work to write about it. And then you can only write down what has been written about. Right? Contribute to an original work, but you have to first list the stuff that the relevant subject matter, if it's been written about before. If it hasn't been written about before, well, you can't study it. Wait. So, her lecture was called The Longest Unwritten Chapter. So, her basic point is that there are long-standing historical intersections. Now, because I was in the audience, and because we also had this discussion back in '06 as part of the larger group. So one of the books that built this class originally, Van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus, she's saying, yeah, historians are like other people in humankind. They argue about all kinds of stuff. So they argue about whether Van Sertima's work is valid, even though he's backing it up with archaeological evidence and linguistic evidence and all kinds of evidence that had been ignored by the Academy. Because the Academy says, oh, Christopher Columbus discovered America. There wasn't anybody else before 1492. And he's saying, yeah, there were. Because I'm from Suriname, a place where they had maroons before Columbus. So I know that there were Africans before Columbus. We know that for a fact. We have the evidence, both in, the genealogical DNA evidence as well as archaeological and stories. But y'all haven't been studying it, so y'all didn't write it down. So that's still, even though it's seminal work, and Taya said, yeah, I'm aware of that. But most scholars, find him problematic, and they try and discredit him because he's not official, right? That piece. So a lot of times you find these references in art. So she noticed a couple of art pieces in certain books, like first they made prayers, then they made relatives. So that's the name, I believe, of a painting or a book. I'm not sure. I didn't have time to research what it was, but she made it as a reference. So it's taking notes furiously, right? So Frances Yellow, the artist, and her work, this particular piece is in the International Review of African American Art, which I believe is a magazine, might be a book too. So, as with any discussion of black people, slavery, the S word, comes up. So the enslavement of Native Americans, also the Indian slave trade. So many people don't know that that was occurring, because that's an invisible chapter. Oh yeah, we discovered Indians, we bought Manhattan for $24 in beads, we made all these land deals, etc., and gradually they became extinct. No. There's more. So, white enslavement of Native Americans by the tens of thousands, like for example, 30 to 50,000 natives were enslaved by the English alone by 1750. Which means if they're doing that, that somehow the native nations that were military powers have been kind of neutralized. But again, let's look at, from the native point of view, just in North America, there are 60 million Native Americans before contact. 150 million on Turtle Island, that is North, Central, and South America. If you do the math, 50, 40, and 60. And that's the population estimates that natives believe were true. So if we just look at North America alone, 60 million reduced to 3 today. So whether it's disease, whether it's war, and it's not so much about fuzzy math, it's about who is going to do the counting. The native people or the U.S. cavalry? All right, so enslavement. So when we're talking about 30 to 50,000 natives enslaved by the English, that's still a drop in the bucket relative to how many millions could have been around. But that's going to be significant. At the same time, there was an African diaspora, basically caused by the slave trade. So the diaspora or diaspora, however you want to pronounce it, basically means people scatter, right? And so if they're scattering mostly because in the context of slavery, which is usually how that term is used, the slave trade, there's also an American diaspora, according to Jack Forbes. Basically out of Charleston, South Carolina is one place that he cites. So Charleston's a seaport, major seaport. It was a slave trading port. And the slaves, Indian slaves, were traded to Europe. The Indies, that is, the British and French and Spanish, islands of the Caribbean and the eastern seaboard, and also throughout the South, too. So native slaves were put in an obfuscating category, slave Negro. Now, wait. So in our racial category, right, they're Native Americans. They're red people. Negro is black, but they're not being referred to as Rojas. okay, or Los Indios, oh, they're Negroes. To basically say, oh, well, they're not white, but they're, and to kind of lump them in with the black Africans, right? So this is kind of like Dawes Darky tent, like we talked about the other day, but in reverse, where black Africans who've been living in Indian country, while being counted in the census by white people, their African blood, their native blood, has been erased bureaucratically. In this one, their native blood is being erased and they're being called black and counted that way. So, between those folks, besides what happened before contact, so, but definitely in Taya's research, she's saying, look, this would have happened as part of a cultural synthesis if these people are put together. Because white folks are already bureaucratically putting them together. They're working side by side on plantations. That definitely happened with the Pequot and the Pequot War when they lost it, right? So, yeah, there's going to be a cultural synthesis. So basically one of the places you're going to see that besides religion and language is food, right? So corn-based Indian food became soul food, cornbread, et cetera, right? Food, basketry, canoes, plants and gourds, folklore like Brer Rabbit. So, for example, did we do the stillness that comes to all yet? Okay, so remember, so Legba is basically giving the message to Rabbit, right? So there's a trickster tale. Legba's a trickster, Rabbit's a trickster, but also that's going to blend with Rabbit trickster tales in southeastern tribes too. So there's a number of cultural congruencies there that make an alliance useful, even in slavery, that will persist after slavery didn't exist unless, or ceased to exist. So around 1800, there's a transition in African American and Native American relations change, because if there's going to be like an alliance, the colonizer is going to make sure that alliance don't persist. So native slavery becomes outlawed or out of practice, and enslavement becomes black only. So African Americans, AA, viewed as natural slaves. So if you're going to, do a practice that makes sense economically, you're going to have to justify it intellectually, so that it becomes part of the invisible infrastructure that supports it. Isn't so philosophical. So the Treaty of Holston, and basically we said to natives, be civilized, be like us, or face extinction. And being like us also means your livelihood is not going to be hunting, which requires free access to the land, but agriculture, which means staying put. Doesn't mean that that's your going, wait, you're going to have to change your life way? Well, yeah, you're going to have to change your life way anyway if you're going to exist. So be like us. And that's hence from that particular framework, that's where you get the 5 civilized tribes. Because there's some people that ain't going to be civilized, like the Apache, Comanche, Navajo, Hopi. Yeah, right? And the 5 civilized tribes are basically southeastern and eastern seaboard, but mostly in the south. So all those places, Alabama is a native word, Tuscarora is a native word, Tuscaloosa, Mississippi, Florida, yeah, I mean all that. Those are all native name places. So there's an increase of not only white-owned plantations into native territory, and there are, as well as naturally black slaves coming in with whites, who some of whom would escape into what Indian country was left. So there, the longer slaves were, so slaves held by, black slaves held by Native Americans by the 5 civilized tribes, okay, were generally treated better. But the longer they were kept in slavery, the more brutal slave owners, the natives, became. So there is that historical record. Generally, it was better because in, some British historians observe that the Native Americans didn't treat their slaves properly. i.e. gave them new clothing, i.e. you could marry the chief's daughter, i.e. you're walking around without chains and you're not being whipped, even though, you know, you're still doing. So what does slavery mean then? Wait, you're sending them to negotiate with whites? How is this a slave? Well, no, you're a go-between. But, okay, well, you're not treating them properly. You're giving them too much freedom. Wait, you can marry the chief's daughter? How is that a slave? Well, yeah, right. Maybe we just have a different idea. So, no, y'all need to treat your slaves better, which means worse. And so that started happening. Kinship, of course, could be a mitigating factor. Are you going to beat your son or daughter if that is not part of your cultural value? Are you going to beat your son or daughter's mother if they're a slave? And this is one of Taya's strengths in terms of her studying the relationships among, for example, the Cherokee, who basically had that kind of mixed relationship where, you know, one Cherokee man that she talks about, Shoe Boots, was very much in love with his black slave wife and had multiple children with them. And basically, he petitioned the tribal council to make his children Cherokee citizens. And they didn't want to do it. And so Taya is talking about, yeah, they loved each other, obviously. And she said, it's a parallel kind of like with Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Okay? Sally Hemings was, yeah, we haven't talked about them yet. Huh? Okay, well, Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife. Half-sister in that, you know, she was begotten from a slave mother, therefore the condition of the child derives from the mother. So basically his wife's sister, half-sister, was a slave because her mother was a slave. Same father, right? So Jefferson was married to, you know, the full-blooded white sister, and Sally was her slave. Well, the wife died. And Sally, I mean, if you see pictures of Sally, she's beautiful. She looks like his wife. They basically started living as husband and wife. But they couldn't marry because, you know, he's at the same time writing all these laws in Virginia that a mixed race woman or a freed slave can't, you know, could be killed, etc. I mean, he's of two minds. I mean, and so many historians will say, yeah, well, Jefferson, you know, the reason he had to keep the slaves is because he was in debt from buying his slaves, and he needed the slaves as collateral. Wait, you're talking about his children. You do understand that. So you ain't going to free your own children from Sally because you're in debt. Like, this is American capitalism. The moral dimension doesn't affect your economic choice. Wow. Now, Sally traveled with Thomas Jefferson to France. We're on French soil. She's a free person. She could have left. But she was in love with him. Clearly they were in love. There's no question about that. And she came back to him with America, by America. But she could have stayed in France. Okay, Shoe Boots wanted to free his kids. Cherokee Council wouldn't let him. And so Ty documents all this. Like, look, clearly they're in love. Clearly he wants to do the right thing. And clearly this is kind of not going to happen. And so she said, then this is why you see this movement in Indian country among the 5 civilized tribes to kick off the black people from the tribal role and incorporate the idea that, oh, well, white blood, you know, we want Indians from a saved tribe, marry another Indian. If not, then marry a white person, but don't marry a black or a Mexican because that's polluting the bloodline. But white people are not polluting the bloodline. Where'd you get that idea? Oh, right. So one path to freedom for black people could be had by marrying a Native American, right? So that would happen. That's logical, right? But Native Americans are noticing, quote, how race works in America. And it's not too good to be close to blacks, to be too close to blacks, and denying close relationships to further your position. So in the majority of the context, then black people are on the bottom of a racial hierarchy in America. And natives are noticing that. Not all of them, not everywhere, but certainly contact and proximity with the colonizers kind of tends to make, oh, well, if this treaty says you need to become like us or face extinction, and part of that being like us is you got to put down your relatives, okay, we'll do that. Okay? But black people know how to thrive because, and I'm basically giving you a real world view of this from the point of view of the people that make totem poles. Even though in English we have this lowest man on the totem pole thing, the view of native people is the lowest person on the totem pole is the strongest because they're holding everybody else up. That's the imagery. Yeah, and notice who's on the bottom usually, like a bear or something like that, right? I mean, yeah. So in that longest unwritten chapter, so there are black Seminoles, and the word Seminole itself essentially means a black native mix. So people like John Horse and Wildcats, who were military leaders of the Seminole and would lead the Seminole into Mexico to freedom and basically cross the border many times. So in the International Review of African American Art in 2000, basically there's another piece around John Horse and Wildcat. So there is a conjoined, what Tyre referred to as a conjoined freedom struggle. So, for example, 1813 to 1850, the Red Stake Rebellion, also known as Red Stake Rebellion, Red Stick Rebellion, also known as the Creek War. Basically, the goal is basically the Creeks against whites. And one of the things that they were trying to resist, basically to throw away tools and clothing of whites in an attempt to deal with colonization. So like, yeah, we're going to physical war, it's like jihad, if you will. Oh, we're gonna just get rid of you, push you out. Good luck with that, right? So in one battle, they came upon a settlement of, just like I talked about on Monday, the Locklears, which is a tribal group of mixed whites, blacks, and natives. And that's who we are. That's our identity. So the Creeks, Red Indians, come upon them. Okay, this is what comes of mixing with white civilization. We're going to be purists here, so they wipe out everybody except for the black slaves. Now, this made press, naturally, so the red stick was, there's blood on the stick, that's why it's red. So they left black slaves alive, and it's kind of black slaves opened the door to a whole bunch of things where a number of people noticed that. So 1817 from this war to 1835, this led in Oregon to the rationale for banning blacks entirely from the state to prevent them from intermixing from Native Americans. And so the proximity of that now makes sense in terms of what Thurston would say later, and we'll probably get to that somewhere later in the broadcast, but I want to be able to give you kind of the bottom line legacy here. So, the African diaspora. There are more black people in Latin America, about 130 million, than there are in America, 40 million. But our racial categories don't know how to deal with that fact. And of course, it's not only mixing with the Spanish, it's also mixing with the indigenous people, which is happening in a number of places, plus freedom struggles, like Cuba. Cuba's always been a hotbed for that since about this time, 1850s or more, as we'll see. Not so much later in this broadcast, but definitely before we get to finals week. So, where black people, of course, would escape, where there was escape in Indian country, they did, as in Jamaica, Palmares, and other places. often the experience mirrors the experience in South America and Central America mirrors the experience here without necessarily the tribal recognition piece that we have here. So basically, you don't necessarily have the extensive tribal official recognition like we do, like the federally recognized tribes. You have some of that in Latin America, but the basic policy as a colonizer was to wipe them out. So, but anyway, easily up to 1/3 of Black America has some native bloodlines. And you can see from some of my favorite examples coming up, this particular blending, in my opinion, has been good for America. And these are just some of the people with name familiarity in the history book. So, starting with my part of my guitar holy trinity: Jimmy, Richie, and Taj. So Jimi Hendrix, Black Indian; Tina Turner, James Brown, Malcolm X, Jesse Jackson. And these are people that haven't just acknowledged their native roots. So Jesse Jackson, Alice Walker, Frederick Douglass, Edmonia Lewis, James Earl Jones, Langston Hughes, Sally Richardson. So, the mixing of African and indigenous people, not a bad thing.
This is CNN. Luke, I am your father.
So, Black Indians. So many mixed blood families were forced to kind of choose one culture over the other for a variety of reasons, policy being one. So because of the U.S. contempt for both African people and American Indians, many families choose to hide either their African and or Indian heritage, depending, right? So definitely in my family, it's easier to be a black person in an all-black town because we're dark enough to pass for black, even though we're Choctaw. Right? Because who wants to go with the other Choctaw on the Trail of Tears? Well, we already done that. We got loaded on the slave ships. We're not doing that. So, throughout post-contact American history, longest and most consistent contact between American Indians and peoples of African descent occurred among those tribes that the federal government designated as the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, and Seminoles. And while most family history is known only by oral history, therefore not necessarily recorded by the colonizer, right? Some information can be found on the freedmen rolls of the 5 civilized tribes. So that's how I was able to find my grandfather, George Washington. But wait, yeah, so when my grandma said, yeah, well, your grandfather's father was named George Washington. Wait, that George Washington? Well, no. Wrong time period. But why are there so many George Washingtons? That's still a mystery for me. Why are there so many George Washingtons? Because then, when I found one that had 10 kids and all that, right? But why George? Oh, he's the father of our country. There's got to be something more to that. So, Darky 10, I think we talked about. And the Cherokee, kicking off their folks, we talked about. So, maybe we've talked about basic memetics. Yes? No? Yes? Okay.
Couple times.
All right. And so this meme, the blood quantum mixing meme, we did that. All right, so types of memes, because just so you know, this comes from a book called Viruses of the Mind, and these are distinction memes. So, for example, advertising memes: mom, apple pie, baseball, hot dogs, Chevrolet. Sexy men, Diet Coke. Sexy women, beer, computers, cars, toothpaste, etc., etc. Joe Camel, Youth Rebellion, smoking. There's also health memes, good hygiene, safe sex, proper diet, rest, exercise. So memes don't have to be toxic. They don't. You can develop resistance to toxic memes, but you have to do it consciously because they're designed to kind of slip into your mind and replicate and mix with other memes. So, toxic mimetic exposure. So natives were exposed to toxic memes of Western civilization, much like exposure to smallpox blankets. Africans had some degree of immunity to many of those memes because many of them, like Christianity, distilled alcohol, the blood quantum thing, were much more benign when we developed them because we also developed controls that made them less toxic in their original context. But white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, as a meme, re-engineered those memes and released them. And so when I talk about re-engineering, you take an idea and you change it subtly, so it's still going to replicate, but the effects of it are going to be more toxic to those who are unguarded with it. Or, for example, you tell a truth is in quotes, it's actually a lie, but you don't tell that lie that it's a lie to the people you're telling it to. So they go on to believe it. And there are lots of ways of doing this. So where else would Cherokees get the idea that the preference for marriage is another Cherokee, another Native American, a white person, but not a black or Mexican, because they pollute the bloodline? Where do you get the concept of polluting a bloodline when indigenously pre-contact the Cherokee believed in the four races concept? That they're just people coming from different direction and they're part of the sacred part of creation. Why would they think that all of a sudden mixing with certain people from certain direction is polluting? So the concept of race existed, right? But you didn't have, that particular meme was not racial supremacy based. So, being Native or Black, Indian, is not a matter of blood quantum, but basically experience and political spiritual and political inclination. So, for example, even white people do not apply blood quantum to themselves. So, right? Are you a 1/32 Irish? Are you a quarter Irish? Third German? I mean, no, it can't be a third, but right? It's not applied. It's not applicable. So, some historical black Indians include Crispus Attucks, Paul Cuffe, Frederick Douglass, John Horse, Morning Dew, Edmonia Lewis, John Mercer, Langston, Bass Reeves, James Beckworth, Moses Harris, Langston Hughes, Josephine Baker, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. Modern black Americans include Christopher Judge, from Teal'c from Stargate, former Duck, Della Reese, the singer, Willie Stargell, the athlete, James Earl Jones, Sally Richardson, the actors, Whoopi Goldberg, the comedian and actress, Tina Turner, Eazy-E, Michael Jackson, Jimi Hendrix, easily a third of black America. Take, for example, Paul Cuffe was born free on Cuttyhunk Island during the French and Indian War, seventh son of 11 children. His father, Kofi, also known as Kofi Slocum, was Ashanti and had been captured at 10, brought to Massachusetts as a slave. His mother was Wampanoag, basically the folks that made first contact with the Pilgrims. He was a skilled carpenter who educated himself. He worked long hours, earned enough money to buy his own freedom in 1746. He eventually bought a 116-acre farm. His father died when Paul was 13. Paul and his brother took over the responsibilities of the farm, cared for their mom. He resented the fact that their last name was the name of the man who had enslaved his father, so he persuaded his brother and sisters to use their father's English first name, Kufi, as their family name. And he was a ship owner and also a colonizer in the sense that he created a new colony. As a free Negro, whose father had been a slave, he was concerned over the status of Negroes in his native state and throughout America, to the extent that he became one of the first to advocate African colonization as a solution to the racial problem. So he traveled to Sierra Leone, a British colony on the west coast of Africa, where he founded the Friendly Society of Sierra Leone for the immigration of Negroes from America. Now, this makes sense why Paul Carter Woodson is going to study native black Indians in Massachusetts, because there's a record, right? And, oh, here's how we free ourselves, and here's how we get economic access. Here's how, we're going to get ourselves back to Africa, buy our own ships, sail ourselves back. Okay? Because it's obviously we're not going to get, America to ship us back. That ain't going to happen. So we're going to have to do it ourselves. The whole Back to Africa movement basically starts in the early part of the 19th century from folks like that. Logical place for Woodson to start. Despite what I said about colonization. Makes sense. Got to start somewhere where it's written down, and it's definitely going to be written down there. In 1815, he spent $4,000 of his own funds to transport 38 Negroes. Wow, imagine sending nearly 40 people to Africa for only $4,000. He planned more expeditions, but died in 1817. And he purchased, basically as a successful ship owner and ship builder, he accumulated an estate worth more than $20,000, which we can do the conversion, that's like 20 million or more here. In 1797, at a price of $3,500, he purchased for himself and his Indian wife a farm in which he built a school for free Negro children. So, if we look at this then as a model for black entrepreneurship, cross-cultural entrepreneurship, get yourself a power base and educate future generations. So they entered a suit as taxpayers against the state of Massachusetts for the right to vote, but they were unsuccessful. So, this is another thing. Not only educating yourself, not only becoming a landowner, but also exercising political power. Again, it's in a colonized context, but you got to basically, be practical and live. Crispus Attucks. So when we talk about, for example, Crispus Attucks we talked about somewhat already. There's a link for him. In patriarchy, particularly male-dominant, the rule of thumb, both in English common law and the practice itself of how you basically subdue a natural resource, even though that natural resource is a woman, a human being, you have the justification then to basically have dominion and subdue natural resources and human beings. So whether that's woman, nature, the world, tame the savage, bring them to God. If a man beats his wife and she comes to her family for protection and they tell her to go back to him, well, they tell her to go back to him because God said so. And the man is always right and the final and ultimate authority. So that's basically some of the conditions of patriarchy that then basically kind of picture into what happens here in terms of colonialism. So part of that meme of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy is divinely ordained manifest destiny and also the white man's burden, which are also mimetic concepts, which we'll be discussing in the not too far distant future. But let's jump to Oregon. So, my partner and I started a history project because between us we had 7 kids in the school district. And one of the things that we want, our oldest son, our sons basically, had listened to some of the things that I was talking about in terms of history and getting in trouble with their teachers for insisting Beethoven was black, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, parent-teacher conference, you know, was interesting. So they said, okay, here we are in January, and you're the only classroom, our son's classroom was the only classroom that was observing or actually teaching on the King holiday. One classroom in the entire school. Wait, just one classroom? Why not the entire school? You're all on break. Why not? Tell them why. Well, what are you doing for Black History? Because we know what the answer to Black History was. Well, nothing. Do you want to do that? So, wait, we're the parents, you're the teacher. It's your job to teach. But here's what we'll do. What Sherry decided to do was basically go and research Eugene Black history, because the usual thing is everybody does Martin Luther King, Montgomery bus boycott, the South, etc., etc. So she's anti-computer and anti-cell phone. So she goes old school to the library and starts with the historical record. That is, every newspaper in existence in the founding of the state, she goes back in there in microfilm and she goes page by page 4 years to the current day. So she found people like Moses Harris, no relation, but he's on your screen right? Thought to have been born around 1800 in Union County, South Carolina. There's no real record, and was believed to be a freed slave. So Moses Harris made many fur hunting expeditions between St. Louis and the Rocky Mountains in the early 1830s. And he spoke the Snake language very well as other native languages. So here's the thing with not only Black Africans and Black African slaves, is that their genetic capacity for multiple languages, as well as cross-cultural alliances. So whether he was totally black or not doesn't matter. You can look at his dress. He's kicking it with native people. In fact, you should know that the whole hippie movement, okay, people who lived among Indians, white people, would grow their hair long. And the penchant for short hair became a way of distinguishing that you were not identifying with native people or people of color. Because, like, again, notice, did Jesus have a buzz cut? Or the ancient people, or ancient world? I mean, no, yeah, notice. Okay, so there was an association in the frontier days. So if you kicked it with Indians and you wore buckskin, you grew your hair long, all right? And there are some people, well, we're civilized, so we're going to see a barber. But notice Moses ain't doing that. So Black Indian is also not just a matter of genes and bloodlines, it's also adopting certain practices. Because it makes sense that you're not necessarily going to kick it in the native world all the time. You might want to be able to travel back and forth. And one of the ways in the time that we're talking about, 1800s, the United States has not started to make the westward push. I mean, getting all the western states from Mexico, that was definitely a coup. But when he was born, that hadn't happened yet. Yeah.
Furthest western border at that time would be the Appalachian Mountain Range.
Right. Right. Yes. It was a natural barrier, so right. People aren't going. Yeah. The whole piece with Lewis and Clark. Oh, we're finding the Northwest Passage, the mythical waterway that goes to the Pacific Ocean through the Rockies. No, not happening, boo. So, it was said of Moses Harris, he was an experienced mountaineer in whom the general reposed, that's General Ashley, reposed the strictest confidence for his knowledge of the country and his familiarity with Indian life. This Harris was reputed to be a man of great leg, that is, and capable from his long sojourning in the mountains of enduring extreme privation and fatigue. His first contact with wagon trains was as a fur trader in 1836, while on one trip he escorted the Whitman and Spalding families as far west as Green River. 2 years later, he escorted another missionary party as far as Fort Laramie, which he earlier had helped locate and build. And this particular picture, this graphic, is him and a companion escaping, I think it's Blackfeet, maybe. 1840, the declining of the fur trade meant the end of one career for Harris. He acted as a guide for one of the largest immigrant trains to come to Oregon in 1844. And basically his agenda with this, so the party divided into 3 large sections, including a wealthy black man, George Bush, no relation, and Michael T. Simmons, John Minto, Nathaniel Ford and his family, and their black servants, Robin, Polly, and Mary Jane Holmes. They will figure, well, we'll talk about them later when we talk about the formation of Oregon in terms of slaves, but they were on that wagon train, which was guided by Moses Harris, as well as another black man who settled here, married a white woman, and was given a special dispensation of land, as was Moses Harris. But they're forming the state to exclude people like Moses Harris, but they make special exceptions for him. So, he decided, because this area was called the Oregon Territory, and in addition, to basically decide where it's going to go, to the British or to Americans. Harris's agenda was to bring in wagon trains so that Americans would outpopulate the British. Because places like Astoria were outposts for the Hudson Bay Company. Okay, the borders with Canada hadn't been established yet. So it was wide open. British established an outpost, but they're not bringing in wagon trains. Okay? The fur trade from Canada is not really populating them. You just have scattered folks. So Harris's agenda is, hey, I want this to be American, even despite his experiences with slavery, et cetera, et cetera. So he's going to lead wagon trains to ensure the population happens. Yeah, your question?
I'm thinking, at that time, I think, didn't the British want to, I think they were trying to gain control of everything from Alaska down to Northern California?
Yes, they were.
Plan?
Yes, they were. But remember, California was Mexico then, so yeah. So basically, the contested territory would be down the coast.
For some reason,
Oregon,
they just gave
Washington.
up and they'd stopped.
Yeah, well, they gave up because Americans overpopulated, partially because of the whole fur trade and also wagon trains, and basically that's where Moses, consciously helped with that particular agenda.
So they got edged out, basically.
Yeah. So Ford had promised Robin Holmes that once they arrived in Oregon, that he would be freed, and upon their arrival in Oregon, Robin and Polly were freed, that is, the parents, but they had to buy their children to free them. And they settled in Corvallis, and they're buried in Corvallis. Yeah, imagine having, oh yeah, you're free, but your kids are still slaves, they're property. And they actually had to sue to do that. So, that wagon train arrived in the winter of 1844. Harris spent the winter. He left the following spring with Elijah White, and who was going east and wanted Harris to guide him back. After they reached the Dalles, Harris decided to return to the Willamette Valley, but he started back. He met Stephen Meek. So these are historical Oregon figures. But no, they don't really teach Oregon history except by video game, right? But Stephen Meek was seeking help for a party of settlers stranded in Central Oregon. So the group had traveled south of the regular trail, trying to cross the Cascades by an old cutoff used by mountain men and trappers. They veered too far south and became stranded in the desert. So they're called the Blue Bucket Party because they picked up some nuggets, which were forgotten until gold was discovered in California. 20 people died in the desert before Moses Harris rescued them. He basically got, because he spoke many native languages, he secured supply from Indians and guided them to the Dells. Now, it's interesting to note here that this is a wagon train full of white people that no white people bothered to want to rescue. And so this black guy negotiates supplies with the Indians, goes to find them, and rescues them. Yeah.
So they were lost somewhere in eastern Oregon, like
Yeah.
around
In the desert.
Burns or somewhere.
Yeah, right, probably. Yeah.
Desolate.
So he remained in Oregon for about 3 years. His name was listed on the tax rolls of Yamhill County. And he signed a petition from the citizens of Yamhill County addressing the Provisional Assembly, urging them to finance the construction of a public road in Oregon City. In the winter of '46, he was called to rescue stranded settlers who were coming into Oregon across the Applegate Cutoff. That's basically down by I-5, roughly. He left the Willamette Valley in the spring of '47, returning to St. Joe, Missouri, where he hoped to guide other settlers to Oregon, but I think he caught cholera. And cholera is basically bad sewage, essentially. But anyway, so one of the first black people, now besides the cabin boy from that ship, Mr. Lopez, I think, Moses is one of the first historical black people in Oregon, besides George Bush. And this is Escape from the Blackfeet. Black Harris, quote unquote, Black Harris and his brother Chapper. So Moses is also known as Black Harris. And his brother Trapper are here making their escape from the terrible Blackfeet, the Bêtes Noires of the Rocky Mountains. The word is Sauve-qui-peut, and spur and whip are both in requisition. Black Harris always created a sensation at the campfire, being a capital raconteur and having had as many perilous adventures as any man probably in the mountains. He was of wiry form, made up of bone and muscle, with a face apparently composed of tan leather and whipcord, finished off with a peculiar blue-black tint as if gunpowder had been burnt into his face. In writing expressed for the Fur Company, in which he had no equal, he told us that in running the gauntlet among hostile Indians, he laid by the day for sleep and rode hard all night. At times, he would raise the envy of the trappers by recounting a discovery he had made somewhere in the Black Hills of a petrified forest, and wind up with some horrible stories of butcheries among the Indians in which he bore a hand. Talk about savages, yeah, right? Like many mountain men, he was a raconteur. A story attributed to him tells of petrified birds sitting in the petrified trees with petrified leaves in Yellowstone. The story became more and more elaborate with retelling by others until finally the birds were singing petrified songs. So this is the classic Alfred Jacob Miller, who actually did lots of different portraitures of Native American and painted Harris here. This is in the book, The West of Alfred Jacob Miller, color version of the portrait by Harris, of Harris, who graces the frontispiece. The trappers in the sketch are en repose. The peculiar caps on their heads are made by themselves to replace felt hats long since worn out or lost. Their fringed shirts, leggings, moccasins, etc. are made by the Indian women and sewed throughout with sinew instead of thread, which they do not possess. So that 5 civilized tribe piece. So we talked about that. So other black Indians, Oregonian, often feared an alliance between blacks and Indians, despite people like Moses Harris. So a British officer once suggested Africans and Indians that they be forbidden from getting together. Florida type situation, basically what happened in Florida is the Seminole. So the blacks and the Creeks or whoever create a new tribe called the Seminole, and they become a military power, forcing the Spanish to sell Florida to the British. And the British solved the problem by heating up a cannonball till it was red hot, firing it in the middle of the gunpowder stash and blowing it up. Boom. And then thus quelling the rebellion. So basically they said, yeah, this is not a good idea to have blacks and Indians mixing together. So a Florida type situation was never going to happen in Oregon, though the natives by themselves had planned a rebellion to get rid of the whites, just like the Red Stick Rebellion. By themselves. They didn't need any encouraging from black people. Right? The problem was only about 200 blacks at the time of the exclusion laws being written. So, for example, in John Horse, who was a Seminole Indian leader, was defeated by American troops at the Battle of Okeechobee. He shared command of the Seminoles with Alligator Sam Jones and Wildcat, 2 figures, so 3 black Seminoles. From the left, John Jumper, Abraham, Billy Bowlegs. This is from the Institute of Texan Cultures. And Seminoles, Floridian from Maroon. So the Seminoles were that reason the Spanish were willing to sell Florida to the British. They couldn't stop raids or conquer them in battle, and that lucky shot ignited the powder stores. So this didn't wipe them out, but it did assist the British being able to hand over Florida to the Americans. Black women of the West. Black Indian, this is Edmonia Lewis, who we didn't really talk about Phyllis Wheatley or other black artists and writers, but one of the things that happens when you're living among white people and you're of mixed heritage yourself is you try and show that you can master the form. So the death of Cleopatra, sculpted by Edmonia Lewis, is a classical style marble sculpture, where Cleopatra, who, again, while she's an African, is being shown here with, classical Greek, i.e. European features. Cleopatra was a mixed-race person, but described as tawny, which means brown, right? Black cowboys. Now, that term cowboy, so you have 2 styles of equestrianism here in America. One is English and the other is Western, and it is in fact Spanish, yes, which means that since you have mixed race African, Native, and Europeans, that these are, and they're going to be out in the sun, they're going to be dark skinned. They refer to themselves as vaqueros, cattle men, but and that's how they refer to themselves in English as cattle men. But cowboy was a disparaging term given to them by Texans. Later that term became the generic term, and then a term of pride, right? So, these black cowboys, if you will, Nat Love claimed to have won the title Deadwood Dick in a roping contest in Deadwood, South Dakota. This photograph is from his autobiography, which was privately printed in 1907. Deadwood Dick, Black Indian cowboy. Jussie Stahl was a roper in the early 1900s, competed in Oregon Rodeo. The judges awarded him second place for a ride that deserved a first place finish, and it was clear that skin color factored into their final tally. To protect the judge's decision, Jussie rode his next bronc facing backwards with a suitcase in his hand.
Take that.
Take that. Bill Pickett invented the sport of bulldogging on his horse Spradley. Mary Fields ran a stagecoach and a mail route. This is Jim Beckworth, African-American mountain man and frontier scout, dressed in fringed buckskin and beaded moccasins. Around his neck hung a pendant of a rifle bullet and two brightly colored oblong beads. Today, he's recognized as one of the great African-American pioneers in California history. Born in Virginia, he escaped from slaveholding South. At his earliest opportunity, headed for the freedom of the West. He was adopted by the Crow Indians and lived with them for a while along the Yellowstone and Bighorn rivers. Among the Snake Indians, he was known as Bloody Arm because of his prowess in battle. This is a famous speech by Frederick Douglass. Oppression makes a wise man mad. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. What have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? By the rivers of Babylon there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof, for they that carried us away captive required of us a song. And they who wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. This is Rochester's Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society in 1852. Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men, too, great enough to give frame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and for the principles that they contended for, I will unite with you in honor their memory. Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilant shouts that reach them. If I do forget, if I do not faithfully remember those bleeding children of sorrow this day, may my right hand forget her cunning, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. To forget them, to pass lightly over their wrongs, and to chime in with the popular theme would be treason most scandalous and shocking, and would make me a reproach before God and the world. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view, standing there identified with the American bondsman, making his wrongs mine. I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me on this 4th of July. So, this is a Black Indian characteristic. Yeah, we're proud to be Americans, but we're going to make America right. And we will speak out about it. And that is also another definition of black. Where do you stand, on the side of the oppressor or the side of the oppressed? And do you speak out about it? So that's a characteristic of them, to look at that particular point of view. So, Samuel Thurston was an American pioneer, lawyer, politician. He was the first delegate from the Oregon Territory to the United States Congress. So this is when it was a territory before it was a state. And was instrumental in the passage of the Donation Land Claim Act. So what this means, the Donation Land Claim Act, is that Indian land can be taken and given away to whites for free. That's the donation. The Indians aren't part of that donation. And this is an inducement to get people to come to Oregon. But he wants to go farther than that. So in 1850, so remember this is 15 years after the Red Stick War, which I didn't know about before talking with Taya and Miles, but since that's her, and it's, when she said this, this makes total sense now, because otherwise it looked crazy. He wrote an address to the Oregon legislature in urging the prohibition of free African Americans from the Oregon Territory, in which said, "It is a question of life or death to us in Oregon. The Negroes associate with the Indians and intermarry, and if their free ingress, that is, travel into the state, is encouraged or allowed, there would a relationship spring up between them and the different tribes, and a mixed race would ensure inimical to the whites. And the Indians being led on by the Negro, who is better acquainted with the customs, language, and manners of the whites than the Indian, these savages would become much more formidable than they otherwise would, and long bloody wars would be the fruits of the commingling of the races. It is the principle of self-preservation that justifies the action of the Oregon legislature." Now that, so in context, then that makes sense, because otherwise, yeah, to me, this is crazy. You're paranoid. We're talking about 200 black people. Really? And the Indians are politically and organized on their own. They don't need us to organize them, but whatever. So, Oregon statutes, if you've never seen them, this is the original language, which was changed in early 2000. An act in regard to slavery and free Negroes and mulattoes being enacted by the Legislative Committee of Oregon as follows. So, where this is coming from, you had to decide, if you were a territory, in order to become a state, you have multiple things going on. The Missouri Compromise basically says we have to balance the number of slave states and free states. So Oregon's going to be a free state by banning black people completely. Right? So there's a group of folks that gather at Champoeg Park, north on I-5, north from here, and basically they're drafting these statements. So it's the Legislative Committee of Oregon. Section 1, no slavery forever in Oregon. Slavery and voluntary servitude shall be forever prohibited in Oregon. If there are any slaves, they have 3 years to leave Oregon. If the owners of slaves don't remove them in 3 years, the slaves are freed. Any free blacks, 18 years or older, if males have 2 years to leave, females 3 years to leave. Not sure of the gender difference, but it makes sense in terms of pregnancy, I guess. Though they don't spell this out. Once you reach 18, you have 2 or 3 years to leave. If you don't leave, you shall be whipped 20 to 39 lashes. If you don't leave after you've been whipped, you will be whipped every 6 months until you do leave. If you are a slave who becomes free, then you have 2 or 3 years to leave. Okay, passed by the Legislative Committee of the Provisional Government of Oregon, June 26, 1844. All right, so Thurston, when he's writing about, okay, we're going to prohibit black people, he's writing after this was written, but he's clearly in line with some of the thinking. even though it doesn't basically talk about, it basically just refers to free Negroes or mulattoes, which is the first generation black-white mix. So they have a change of heart. They pass that in the summer. Christmas time, they have a change of heart. First, they repealed Section 6 and 7, the whipping clause. Now, here's the Black Indian analysis. Whenever they lift off the chains, they're about to put on stronger ones. But don't expect those chains to be obvious. They'll be more subtle. Any black who fails to leave can be arrested and, if found guilty, be sold to the lowest bidder for service to someone who agrees to remove them from the state within 6 months after that service expires. That person must post a bond of at least $1,000 after winning the bid, the lowest bid, right? Because we're not doing slavery here. You're a criminal. Okay? And we will sell you contract labor, like a chain gang, to the lowest bidder, but that bidder also has to pay $1,000. So that's almost as if you had been bought outright, except we're not doing slavery because it's the lowest bidder, not the higher. But I mean, notice this is clever, fiendishly clever. So you can then be worked to pay off your debt. And if the prevailing wage is 50 cents a day, and you do the math, it will take you 3 years to pay off the $1,000 bond. Or 2 years, either way, 2 or 3 years, depending. Now, the historical record, such as it is, says that only one person was so charged under this law. Jacob Vanderpool, a Salem free businessman who owned a hotel, a casino, and a restaurant in Salem. So he's a business owner. And he was arrested and theoretically deported. So this is before the Constitution, 1844, still. Here's the Oregon Constitution. Article 1, Section 31. White foreigners have the same rights as native-born whites in Oregon. This is basically to encourage European immigration. No slavery or servitude unless as punishment for a conviction. Right? You saw that coming. No blacks, not at the time of the state, at the time this Constitution can come, reside, buy property, make contracts, or sue in court. The legislature shall provide for the removal of all blacks from the state and punish those who bring, employ, or harbor them. And this was repealed in 26, and that language was repealed in 2000. Blacks and Asians are not permitted to vote. No Negro, Chinaman, or mulatto shall have the right of suffrage, repealed in 1927. No Asian can buy a property or a mining claim or work a mining claim in the state. So I call your attention to, just like original position in the Bible, you do not forbid something that is not happening. It has to happen so you can forbid it, predictably. So what's going on is people are coming up from Oregon, from California, and other places, gold mining. And wait, no, we want that for just white people. So y'all gotta go. So this is from the Salem, Oregon Statesman, August 4th, 1857, and an op-ed basically talking and urging ratification of the Constitution. So I should also point out, this little clause here. No slavery or servitude unless as punishment for a conviction. This becomes the 13th, so this is in 1857, fully ratified in 1859 when the state, Oregon becomes a state on February 14th. This becomes the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, outlawing slavery. Notice how it does it. We're outlawing involuntary servitude, which is code for slavery, but except if you're convicted of a crime. And it's the states that determine what a crime is. So that becomes reading. That becomes trying to work outside of agriculture. That becomes a bunch of crimes that aren't crimes in the North or in the West. Loitering, anything, yeah. In arriving at this conclusion, we are not influenced by hostility to the institution of African slavery per se. We are of the opinion that in the sugar and cotton growing states, it is a necessary, if not indispensable, system of labor. We believe also that the African, whatever his nominal condition, is destined to be the servant and subordinate of the superior white race. And it is best for both races that that servitude and subordination be regulated by law. And we believe also that the wisdom of man has not yet devised a system under which the Negro is as well off as he is under that of American slavery. Still, we think that our climate, soil, situation, population, etc. render it to any useful extent an impossible institution for Oregon. Yeah.
Such flowery language.
Such flowery language, I know, it's great.
Breathtaking.
In early November 1857, the voters of Oregon approved the proposed state constitution by a decisive margin. At the same time, slavery was excluded, 7,727 to 2,645, and free Negroes were prohibited from settling in Oregon, 8640 to 1,081. The pro-slavery vote, compared to the amount of agitation that had emanated from the pro-slavery camp, made the whole affair seem like a tempest in a teapot. The electorate wanted none of the Negro race. Free Negroes were barred from Oregon by an even greater majority than slavery. So pretty clear, no, we're not going to be a free state. We're going to ban black people, free black people. So, generators have often in traditional and contemporary America, because so this was a statement made by a earlier generation of student in this class. Slaves were, of course, Africans made good slaves because they were so smart. Slaves were smart because Africans were smart, and often smarter than we were allowed to think. So, for example, this was, I believe, in Asante. Right? Aluma defeated the Taita and the Tuaregs, employing Turkish infantry and musketeers who had worked in Egypt as part of his army. Aluma was able to defeat most of his neighbors with the new weapons brought into his empire. That means guns. We have enough information from travelers and tradition to say that the trade in cola, ivory, gold, salt, and people fueled a lot of commerce. And Amina of Zaria was preeminent as a military leader and must be considered alongside the panoply of African conquerors such as Taharqa, Ramses, Thutmose III, Sundiata, and Sunni Ali Ber. As a female military leader, she is clearly in the company of Amarnas and Yanenga. One fought Caesar's army and stopped them dead in their tracks as they sought to invade Nubia. The others stormed out of the grassy plains of West Africa with thousands of loyal cavalry troops to establish the Mossi dynasty. So when we speak of Amina of Zaria, we must all see her in the context of some of the world's greatest fighting women. Now, part of why this is talking about certain African traditions of any sex, any gender could be a military commander. We're setting up this context in the New World with people like Nanny in Jamaica and Harriet Tubman and a bunch of other leaders where it's natural to have the question of will women in the military, gays in the military, does not come up. Because practically you want your best fighters, whoever they are, wherever they are. So Usman continued to write treatises against the local rulers, especially the leaders of Gober. He had two main complaints. First, the political leaders had allowed the traditional African culture to corrupt Islam. Second, the local leaders did not protect Muslims from enslavement. Tell us why you are fighting us and enslaving our free people. You say you have done this because of our paganism, and I say we are innocent of paganism and is far from our compound. If praying and giving of alms, knowledge of God, fasting in Ramadan, and the building of mosques is paganism, what is Islam? So we're talking about, these things that we're seeing with ISIS. This is nothing new. Yeah, Christians are fighting Christians, Muslims are fighting Muslims. Who's got the true faith? Yeah, right. Let me see here for a second.
Makes me proud to be a pagan.
Yes, indeed. I wonder, should we go into this now? Generation of Crisis, the Civil War, 4th of July is a slave. Five minutes. Can't do that as 5 minutes. But I will do this. Revolts against slavery. Thank you. Got that. Yeah, and this is even within the same time period. That's good. Okay. David Walker's Appeal, an anti-slavery pamphlet published by David Walker in Boston, called for a slave revolt in 1829. Macon B. Allen, the first black lawyer in the United States, admitted to the bar of Worcester, Massachusetts in 1845. And Frederick Douglass publishes the first of his slave narratives. He publishes his newspaper, the North Star. And why the North Star? Well, it's actually Kilvar, or Polaris.
Okay.
Yes.
That constellation.
Yeah, that constellation.
That was in the right part of the sky.
Yes. Almazan
Yep.
is the constellation, yeah. Sarah Roberts, barred from a white school in Boston, her father files the first school integration suit in 1848. 1850. Massachusetts Supreme Court rejects Charles Sumner's arguments for school integration and establishes separate but equal precedents. So, Sumner is also a radical Republican. Fugitive Slave Act passed by Congress, 1850. Basically, there is a responsibility to capture a fugitive slave from another state and return them to Massa. Black abolitionists invade Boston courtroom and rescue a fugitive slave. They disperse the slave catchers in Pennsylvania, Syracuse, New York courtrooms. Martin Delany publishes The Condition, Elevation, Emigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States. Dr. Delany becomes one of the first black doctors in the U.S. Army, And he also writes a book that's a fictional account of a slave insurrection in Cuba that inspires a slave insurrection in the United States. But this book, The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States, is online. And when you look at the level of the writing and language in it, basically he's one of the folks that, along with Paul Coufet, later become part of the whole Back to Africa movement. Oh, the only solution to slavery, we gotta leave. Bye. Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin, if you haven't read it, so when people call other people an Uncle Tom, they actually need to understand, actually read the book. Let's try that. So it's not, the Uncle Tom's shuffling, yes, massa, is an act, because to put the whites off at ease. He's actually helping slaves to escape through that act. So to put somebody down for being an Uncle Tom that's actually working for your liberation, that's a little ignorant. Don't just look at the action. Look at the results of the action. So, run up to the Civil War. 1775, blacks are excluded from the Continental Army. In 1775, the generals decide to bar slaves and free blacks from the Continental Army. Congress approves. A British lord, next month, offers freedom to any blacks who will fight for the British. Divide and conquer. Washington himself issues orders to forbid blacks in the army. Washington reverses himself and authorizes recruitment of free blacks New Year's Eve. Smart move, George. As with the Revolutionary War, blacks volunteered in numbers to fight for the Union forces. And we'll leave it there. So the Hannibal Guards of Pittsburgh, the Crispus Attucks Guards of Albany, and similar groups in Philadelphia and New York and Boston organized to recruit black volunteers for the Civil War. So these will be up later, and see you next week. And I should also have your midterms back to you next week too. 5 civilized tribes.